Welcome back to the Reconstructed Church's Sunday service in Colossians part 13. And 13 is my favorite number, so I saved a special one for today. But enough with the small talk. Let's cut to the chase and start today's lesson as we answer the question, what is circumcision actually all about? All right, now today's lesson will blow your mind if you have never heard it before, because there are real answers in the Bible for why God required Abraham and the Jewish people, at least prior to the coming of the Messiah, to practice circumcision. But before we get into that, let's go ahead and read Colossians chapter 2, verses 6 to 15, and I'll be reading from the ESV. Therefore, as you received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him, and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have been filled in him, who is the head of all rule and authority. In him also you are circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God, who raised him from the dead. And you, who were dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God has made alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses, by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and put them to open shame by triumphing over them in him. Now, before we get to why God chose circumcision as the sign of the covenant he made with Abraham, let's first make sure everyone knows what circumcision is. Now, circumcision is the practice of removing the foreskin of the male reproductive organ. And I'm trying to keep this PG here. But circumcision is the practice of removing foreskin. And this may surprise you, but the Jews were not the only ones to practice circumcision. There were other nations and peoples that practiced it. For instance, the Egyptians. They would perform a type of circumcision where the male organ was circumcised parallel rather than perpendicular. And this is actually why some scholars argue that in Joshua 5:2, Moses is told to circumcise the sons of Israel a second time. And then in Joshua 5:9, it says that this was because today the Lord rolled away the reproach of Egypt from Israel. And it is possible that some of the men had been circumcised as an Egyptian, and they would have to be circumcised again, along with any male who had been born in the wilderness being circumcised for the first time. But although other nations practiced circumcision, for the Israelites, both the men and the women, and I'm going to explain why I included the women in that statement in a few minutes. But for male and female Jews, circumcision was much more than a marking of their flesh. So let's explain the real meaning behind circumcision and tell me if this doesn't blow your mind by the wisdom and affection of our God. Okay, to answer the question why God chose circumcision as a sign of his covenant with Israel, we need to look at good old Father Abraham. Now, if you don't remember, we meet Abraham in Genesis 12, where God seemingly out of the blue speaks to this man named Abram. God later changes his name to Abraham, but at the time, his name is Abram. And a quick side note, have you ever wondered why Abraham wasn't freaked out by this? There is seemingly no context to set up Abram's story, other than the list of names in the table of nations in Genesis 11 prior to God calling Abram. So why would this man Abram from Ur of the Chaldees know and trust this God that seemingly calls him out of nowhere? Well, it's because of the events in the three falls that we discussed in earlier episodes of Colossians. You see, Abram's ancestors lived when the Nephilim and the Apkallu led to the rebellion at the Tower of Babel. And Abram would have had firsthand witness testimony from his ancestors that the gods and the God interacted with mankind. And Abram would have known the story of the garden when Adam and Eve walked with God and their supernatural family members. You see, friends, his culture was accustomed to the supernatural. Now, our culture has a harder time believing in God and his enemies and even the spiritual realm because we have become so technologically advanced. We have almost become too smart for our own good. But Abram's time was different. And so was ours not too long ago. Friends, up until the Enlightenment, which led to the Industrial Revolution, everyone, or at least most everyone, believed in the supernatural world and the existence of God and or gods. But today, people will believe that we humans came from natural evolution over billions or millions of years by chance, rather than opening up their eyes to see the wonder of their creator. But that wasn't always the case, friends. But back to Abraham and circumcision. And in Genesis chapter 12, we see that God speaks to Abraham and tells him that he is going to be the father of many nations. And then in Genesis 15, God makes a covenant with Abram, and we learn that the sign of this covenant is circumcision. But there is a major problem, you see. Sarai, later Sarah, his wife, is barren and past the years of child rearing. And so she laughed at God when he told her that she would be a mother. But the reality is, God had to miraculously intervene in order for Sarai to become pregnant and bear with Abram a child. And friends, this is a clue to why God chose circumcision as the sign of the Abrahamic covenant. Now, remember back to our prior lessons where we discussed Genesis 6 and what happened there? Well, the sons of God decided to rebel and have sexual relations with the daughters of men. And this was done by the rebellious sons in order to try to thwart the prophecy that God gave in Genesis 3:15, that through the seed of the woman, one would be born that would crush the head of the serpent and defeat death, saving God's people. And the people in Abram's time would have been very aware of these rebels. I mean, these rebels are the origin of the giants. Remember David and Goliath? And so all the surrounding nations would have known about the Genesis 6 rebellion. And friends, this is why God chose circumcision as his sign of the covenant. Friends, think about it. Abram and the peoples and nations that surrounded him were fully aware of the ability for the gods to impregnate women. And so God, in his wisdom, chooses a woman who is past her child-rearing years to birth his nation, which would become the Israelites, God's chosen people and the lineage of the Messiah. Think about it. The rebellious sons of God are not on the level of power as the Creator God. Their power is way more than ours, at least apart from ours when God's Spirit is in us. But they are not as powerful as our God. They're like fleas, and he is the roaring lion. So God chose a husband and wife who needed their Creator's intervention to bear a son and birth God's chosen people. Friends, just like Jesus was birthed through the miracle of incarnation, the Jewish people were birthed through the miracle of the true and living God opening the womb of a woman way past the years of her ability to do so. And circumcision wasn't just a sign for the men, it was also for the women. Let me explain. You see, in Joshua chapter 5, the entire nation of Israel was circumcised or circumcised a second time. And now again, I'm going to try to keep this PG. But if every man in the area had just been circumcised, then during their recovery, no woman would have been able to get pregnant. Think about it. And so, friends, as the Israelites entered into the promised land, the birth of their nation, so to speak, every male would have been sexually incapacitated for a period of time and no babies were being made. So why did God choose circumcision as a sign of his covenant? Well, because every time a circumcision is performed by a Jewish family, they were supposed to remember Abraham and Sarah and how she was barren. And they were supposed to remember the entrance into the promised land when the whole nation was birthed and every male was freshly circumcised, both alluding to the fact that God himself, and solely through his miraculous power and wisdom, birthed a nation when it would have been impossible to happen naturally or by a lesser powered God. Friends, circumcision is a reminder of God's intimate devotion to the people of Israel, all Israel. Okay, well, you say, but I am not Jewish. And Paul said we don't have to circumcise anyone anymore since the new covenant. So what does all this have to do with me personally? Everything, friends. Now back to Colossians to wrap this up. You see, in Colossians 2:11, it says, in him also you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. And friends, whether they were male or female, they were both affected by the circumcision in the entering of the promised land. And friends, today, whether you are male or female, the removal of the male foreskin is no longer the covenant. Now the covenant is internally, where God himself, through his Spirit and by our faith in him, circumcises our hearts. And rather than the blood of the circumcision of Abraham's covenant, we have the bread and the wine of the new covenant to remember that God birthed each one of us, each one of his children, each one of his holy ones, a new heart. And friends, this birth is also a miracle that can only be performed by the true and living God. No lesser God can free you from the burden of death placed on you by our forefathers, Adam and Eve, nor the rebellious sin of our own hearts. Only God can remove the legal demands and debt that is on us. And friends, now our circumcised hearts are our daily reminder of the miracle of new birth our God chose to gift us all with, all who are called and believe in faith. And friend, if you haven't believed in faith yet, maybe today is the day. Just cry out to the true and living God, and he will hear you. It is literally his greatest desire. For God is glorified in the salvation of his people. And friends, we are then safe in his arms. Now, next week, we're going to be looking at what it means to have the legal demands against us canceled. Thanks for joining us, friends. We will see you soon.